Let's start today talking a little bit about vaccines. At this relatively later stage in the pandemic for the United States, there's much still to be done globally. But at this stage in the US, where we could be moving even more quickly in crushing the virus, 41% of Republicans still refuse to get themselves vaccinated. And sadly, this number is down only 2 percentage points from last month. You might remember last month we had a new poll which said 43% of Republicans are refusing the COVID vaccine. That has declined, but only 2 percentage points to 41. This is a new PBS NPR Marist poll, which finds that only 4% of Democrats say, I don't want the vaccine. And yet 41% of Republicans say they do not plan to get vaccinated. And this truly could lead to more eventual deaths for Republicans than for Democrats, which would, at least to some degree, shift the electoral balance. What I mean by that is, if mostly Republicans are dying once we get to the point at which everyone who wants a vaccine has gotten a vaccine, it seems that would be bad for Republicans in their races. And maybe that and that alone at some point or in some way will influence Republican elected officials to encourage their voters to get vaccinated. But consider the absurdity of this situation. The people who all along have been saying there's really no serious pandemic here. We don't have to do anything special. We don't have to go out of our way to behave any differently, open everything right away, get masks off. Those very people who are the ones that never wanted to wear masks and don't want to get vaccinated are the ones that say open everything. Well, wearing the mask when that was the right thing before we knew that vaccinated people no longer need to wear masks per the CDC, getting vaccinated, that would help us open as quickly as possible. And yet they are refusing to do it. Now, overall, 24% of the entire country does not plan to get vaccinated, which is okay for herd immunity once kids can get vaccinated. What I mean is, if we do vaccinate 76% of all Americans, by all measures, that's enough to completely crush the curve and get to a practical herd immunity. There will be sort of like a super immunity in states where people almost all want to get vaccinated, places like California, New York, Massachusetts, where there's more than 90% interest in vaccination. They will have like a super immunity. On the other hand, you will have cluster outbursts among unvaccinated people in some parts of the country that are not so big on getting themselves vaccinated. But the issue is no longer vaccine supply. And that's maybe one of the most infuriating aspects of this. We have the incredibly fortunate situation that many countries are dreaming of, which is vaccines for everyone. There are countries desperate to get vaccines and start vaccinating people. We have vaccines. All adults are eligible. Anyone 12 and over is eligible for the Pfizer vaccine. In most states, you can now just walk in, no appointment, just go and get a vaccine. And 41% of Republicans just don't want it. And it's a very similar situation with abortion. I've used this analogy before. They say, we want 0 abortions. Great. We know how to get in that direction. Give everybody contraception at no cost out of pocket. Teach everybody comprehensive sex education. This reduces the number of unwanted pregnancies and it reduces the demand for abortions. Oh, no, we don't want to do that. That's crazy. That either violates our conscience or it violates our religion or it violates our morality or whatever the case. That's how you reduce abortions, though, and they don't want to do it. And it's the exact same thing here. Hey, we want everything back to normal. Cool. Just wear a mask for now until the CDC says you don't have to. And as soon as you can get yourself vaccinated, get yourself vaccinated. No, not that. That we're not going to do. It is fascinating that many of the same people who believed in hydroxychloroquine, absent any reason to believe in it as a treatment for COVID, don't believe actual science like vaccines. The good news is it's mostly the unvaccinated who remain at risk. Now, it's not 100% like that because there are some people who can't get vaccinated because of specific medical conditions. So you getting vaccinated protects them. There are people, remember, when we say the vaccine is 92 to 95% effective, that means 5 to 8% of people who get the vaccine, but because of a normal bell curve distribution, never develop antibodies, even though they did go and get themselves vaccinated. So do the respectful thing. Do it for your fellow Homo sapiens. Go and get yourself vaccinated, not necessarily or not only because you're assessing your personal risk, but because you're a member of society. You're a member of the human race, and maybe you would do something that has somebody else in mind. I know that that's a crazy idea. So the bad news, 41% of Republicans still don't want the vaccine. The good news, if we are to focus on the good news, is mostly the risk of people not vaccinating is to themselves, although there is still risk to others. And that number has gone down a little bit, 43% to 41%. It's a little bit better. We'll continue to track vaccination numbers and maybe have an update, maybe tomorrow, maybe on Thursday. You really have to see this to believe it. The very same Republican congressman who denied that there was any insurrection on January 6th has now been caught in pictures showing him looking panicked and barricading the doors of the House of Representatives with furniture to try to stop the insurrectionists, who he claimed don't exist, from coming into the House of Representatives. I'm speaking about Republican Congressman Andrew Clyde. Just last week, he said the riot looked like a, quote, normal tourist visit. Those are comments for which he was rightly excoriated. Ridiculous comments. Here is a picture of the same Andrew Clyde who said insurrection. No, this is just a tour. Here he is pushing a piece of furniture surrounded by security guards up against the doors of the House of Representatives. That's a normal tourist visit. Normal tourist visits require members of the House of Representatives to barricade the doors with furniture. Here's another picture of Clyde, and he looks, to say he looks scared for his life is not an exaggeration. It doesn't look like a normal congressional tourist visit to me. This was Clyde's original comment. You really have to see it to believe it.
Let me be clear. There was no insurrection, and to call it an insurrection, in my opinion, is a bold-faced lie. Watching the TV footage of those who entered the Capitol and walked through Statutory Hall showed people in an orderly fashion staying between the stanchions and ropes, taking videos and pictures. You know, if you didn't know the TV footage was a video from January the 6th, you would actually think it was a normal tourist visit.
It was a normal tourist visit. And yet Congressman Andrew Clyde holding up furniture against the door to prevent the insurrectionists from breaking in. I haven't heard a response from Clyde yet to these pictures being uncovered, but what could he possibly say? Oh, he was trying to pull down the furniture to let the peaceful visitors in. The image is deceptive because he was taking down the barricades, not putting them up. I can't even imagine what kind of response there would be here, but that's one of the most absurd that I can think of. Another possibility would be like maybe to argue semantics. Yes, they were breaking in. Yes, some of them were being violent. Yes, they were trespassing, but we can't call it an insurrection because they didn't really have a plan for how they would govern if they succeeded in overthrowing the government and stopping the process of counting the electoral votes. Like in some literal semantic sense, because they didn't have a plan for taking over control of the government, it's not an insurrection. I don't know, but bottom line, this is yet another attempt to normalize the situation. And what this goes to is that if they can make us think, if they can make us believe that what took place was normal and just blown out of proportion, maybe by the left, maybe they were not even real Trumpists, as they love to say, then they and their fellow Republicans might be off the hook for any wrongdoing in pushing for that January 6th insurrection by spending months claiming the election was stolen. And that, of course, includes Donald Trump as well. In normal circumstances, by which I mean sometime in the past, not recently, we might have thrown these people out of government by now. But Republican victimhood has allowed them to cry foul, to blame everybody else, and to continue to wreak havoc and do damage in their Senate and House of Representative jobs and roles. And case in point, yesterday's story about Marjorie Taylor Greene and her long record of harassment of fellow Congresswoman Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, that type of behavior would get almost anyone fired from their job if you treated a coworker in that way. If in my organization, I found out that somebody did what Marjorie Taylor Greene has done to Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, I would have to meet with them and I would have to say, you can't work here anymore. This is it. That's not how this works. It's not allowable. We can't have that. It's outrageous. But they have, to some degree, successfully normalized all of this stuff. And that has also included obvious lying. Obvious lying has been completely normalized as well. So, you know, if I could wrap up with something optimistic or forward looking that is anything other than just horrible desperation for some kind of semblance of normality, I would. But I don't see any appetite from the American right wing, from the Republican Party, from particularly this Trumpian wing of the Republican Party, to hold any of these people accountable. And so the fear is, and I think that the last few months have shown us that it's a well-founded fear, the fear is they will continue to do this stuff and attempt to rewrite history, normalize absolutely horrendous things well into the 2022 election. And if Donald Trump gets his way and he gets to decide who is on the approved list of good boys and bad boys, good girls and bad girls, and who wins in 2022, not only may Republicans take over the House, it may be a particularly Trumpian Republican wing that takes over the House. And it sets the stage for Trump, or maybe, if you can imagine, someone even worse in 2024. So I don't think this is trivial stuff. And I know we started with just the kernel, which is a guy who was barricading the doors now claims there really wasn't an insurrection. And it is a form of gaslighting that leads to a lot of potentially horrible things getting into the midterms in the 2024 election. So we will continue to follow it. And there are others like Clyde making similarly outrageous statements, which maybe we'll talk about later this week. Remember that Monday, Memorial Day, we are doing a one-day membership special. If you've been thinking, I don't know, maybe I'll get one of those memberships. Get a membership before they run out. On Monday, Memorial Day, we'll be doing a big one-day discount. You can get on my mailing list at davidpakman.com, and Monday, Memorial Day, you'll get an email telling you how to sign up. The David Pakman Show depends on your support, and the easiest way is through membership, which includes the world-famous bonus show, as well as commercial-free audio and video streams of the show just for members. Sign up today at joinpakman.com. Coupon code saves you 40%, BETTER21. Let us not forget that this program is an independent media program. We have no corporate backing. We have no big corporations or rich dudes or gals fueling our program. And as a result, we depend mostly on individual subscriptions from people just like you. I've met many of them. They really are just like you in all of the best ways. And you can sign up at joinpakman.com. You will get access to the daily bonus show, as well as commercial-free audio and video streams of the show. And if you would like a discount, you can use the code BETTER21 to save hugely off of the cost of a membership. There is a new report from Axios reporter Jonathan Swan, which tells the story of a Donald Trump temper tantrum in which, after losing the 2020 election, Trump tried to just pull troops from around the world. Now, you might think, that's great. I want to bring our troops home. We shouldn't have troops all over the world the way that we do. And I would agree with you, but this was not a foreign policy calculation by Donald Trump. This was not a well-crafted decision to reduce the military presence around the world. This was not a calculated and much discussed strategy for reducing the spread of the American military throughout the globe. This was a temper tantrum over losing the election. On November 9th of 2020, you might remember that's the day after the media finally said, okay, Joe Biden won. John McEntee, one of Donald Trump's favorite aides, gave a note to Army Colonel Douglas Macgregor. And on that note, it said, this is what the president wants you to do. Get us out of Afghanistan, get us out of Iraq and Syria, withdraw completely from Germany, and get us completely out of Africa. And Macgregor explained, we can't really just do this by January 20th. And I certainly just can't do it by myself. And McEntee said to Macgregor, well, do what you can. And Macgregor said, I really can't do anything. I need like a real order from the president. I can't just go and pull all of our troops from around the world. 2 days later, and this is all based on Jonathan Swan's Axios reporting, such a letter was delivered to the acting Secretary of Defense, Christopher Miller. All U.S. military forces are to be withdrawn from Somalia by December 31st. All U.S. forces are to be withdrawn from Afghanistan by January 15th, with similar unrealistic dates. And Miller wondered what the hell is going on here. The Department of Defense called the White House lawyer Pat Cipollone and asked, what is going on here? They called Trump's national security advisor, Robert O'Brien. No one had any idea what was going on. This wasn't a plan. This wasn't policy. This was just a very strange temper tantrum. And as Jonathan Swan writes for Axios, the U.S. government's top national security leaders soon realized they were dealing with an off-the-books operation by Trump himself. Ultimately, it didn't happen. But as you can see, this is not the action of a president who wanted to do these things because they were the right things to do. If they were, he wouldn't have waited until November 9th of the last year of his first term to do it. It was a triggered, tilted man, furious that he lost, seemingly wanting to create as much chaos as possible for Joe Biden, who would be replacing him just 2 months later. And as Jonathan Swan writes, quote, Christopher Miller told associates he had 3 goals for the final weeks of the Trump administration. Number 1, no major war. Number 2, no military coup. And number 3, no troops fighting citizens on the streets of the United States. Think about the insanity of the situation when the acting national security advisor, acting Secretary of Defense, says, my goals for the lame duck period are preventing Trump from starting a war, preventing Trump from using the military for a coup, and preventing Trump from deploying troops to fight citizens on the streets of the United States. The more we read stories like this one, the more we realize just how insanely close we came to an even greater level of chaos. The stuff that was apparently narrowly avoided almost makes the January 6th insurrection look relatively mild in comparison. And between the riots and Trump trying to overturn the election results and stay in power, and on a whim saying pull all troops from everywhere, and having lawyers in and talking about martial law or seizing voting machines or whatever else, the stuff that happened is bad enough. But look at all of the things we're learning about that almost happened. And as I've said when Donald Trump left, it was way worse than we knew. Over time, we're going to learn more, but I don't know that we'll ever really learn the full scope of exactly how bad it was. And this is just yet another thing. And I know that, you know, there are probably going to be people in my audience. I've already seen it in other enclaves. There's probably some people in my audience who maybe identify with what is sometimes called the revolutionary left, who will say this was Trump outflanking the left on the spread of the American military. Trump was trying to pull troops from all these places that troops arguably shouldn't even be in. And now leftists like David Pakman are saying that it was a bad idea. I'm not saying it was a bad idea. And I've been arguing for drawing down troops in Germany and in many other places for a decade on this program. The point is, this wasn't policy. This was the day after the election was called for Biden. Trump, without consulting with anyone and for no strategic reason, for no well thought out foreign policy reason, just says, I'm going to create an S storm, for lack of a better term, for Joe Biden, and just start pulling troops haphazardly. It is not policy. And this is not how anybody who is a thinking individual would say it should be done. We should be drawing down troops. We should be reducing our military footprint. There's no question about it. But if you do it as policy, you don't do it once you're already a lame duck. That doesn't make any sense, and that's pathetic. We had every reason to believe that very soon Matt Gaetz and his crime story would be back in the news. And it has just exploded back into the news as Gaetz associate Joel Greenberg has now pleaded guilty to 6 federal crimes, including sex trafficking of a teen. Exactly the same crime that Matt Gaetz is being investigated for. Now, as a reminder, Joel Greenberg is a former tax collector in Florida's Seminole County. When we learned that this Joel Greenberg decided to cooperate with investigators, Greenberg's lawyer, Fritz Scheller, held a hilarious press briefing outside a courthouse and was straight up asked, did your client, Joel Greenberg, introduce Matt Gaetz to underage girls? And check out the then hilarious response from Greenberg's lawyer.
Did your client introduce Matt Gaetz to any underage girls for sexual relations?
All right. So I'm just going to let you sit down there, and so I can look over your head and ignore that question. I apologize. I just can't answer that question. I wasn't okay. That was a little devious. You hiding down there below, and then you zing that at me, you know. So
yeah, well, it's looking very, very bad. Again, 6 guilty pleas for Joel Greenberg: sex trafficking a minor, ID theft, stalking and fraud. And again, remember, we learned a couple of weeks ago about a letter sent by Joel Greenberg to Roger Stone admitting that he introduced Matt Gaetz to young girls. The 6 charges that Greenberg has pled guilty to, that's down from 33 charges. We can only imagine it's 6 instead of 33 because of his cooperation, which should be very scary for Congressman Matt Gaetz. Now, on the sex trafficking of a minor charge, the specific admission is that Greenberg admits to recruiting women for commercial sex acts and paying them more than $70,000 between 2016 and 2018. This is quickly getting very ugly for Matt Gaetz. And the only question now is if and when Gaetz will get indicted. Some people called into the show last week and said, David, of course Gaetz is getting indicted. I'm not sure, and we'll get back to that. Gaetz has, of course, denied all wrongdoing. And on the Friday show this week, I'm going to talk a little bit about, do sexual assault allegations matter anymore in politics? Do they matter to Democrats but not to Republicans? Or do they not matter at all at this point in time? We're going to talk about that Friday. Maybe in this case, Republicans should go sort of with the Trump riots defense. Remember how Trump has said, you know, it wasn't real Trumpists rioting on January 6th. It was like Antifa in disguise or something. Maybe they go with Matt Gaetz is really Antifa in disguise. Matt Gaetz isn't really a Republican. I don't know. It's important to remember, though, that if you are Joel Greenberg, you do not plead guilty even to the 6 charges, never mind 33, unless you really are had dead to rights by investigators. You are setting yourself up at least potentially for some serious prison time by pleading guilty. You do not plead guilty to sex trafficking of a minor unless you have figured out a way to get leniency by informing about others or something. Now, in all seriousness, are we going to get accountability? Because for the last several weeks, Gaetz almost seems emboldened by this investigation. He's been running around doing these America First tour events, promoting all sorts of election lies, writing off this entire investigation as some kind of partisan witch hunt, which he conveniently fails to mention that the investigation started under Donald Trump. Donald Trump's Justice Department started looking at Gaetz, but was stonewalled by political appointees to the Justice Department who were political appointees of Donald Trump. So it's a story with so much of what's wrong right now. 2-tier justice system, cronyism, belligerent arrogance, hypocrisy, double standards. It's everything. Let's now see if there is accountability. I hope that there is. Last week or the week before, I said, I don't know if Gaetz is going to end up indicted. I got a few calls and even played a voicemail from one caller who said, David, I don't know if you're just trying to be balanced, but of course Matt Gaetz is getting indicted. I'm not so sure. Let's see if there is accountability. It seems as though the leash is starting to tighten and we're going to continue following it. We will have more coverage of the Matt Gaetz fiasco on our Instagram, which you can find at David Pakman Show. If you want to see video of my garden, if you want to break from politics, check out my really intense lettuce, yes, Lettuce, on my Instagram, david.pakman. Find me there. Quick break, back after this. The David Pakman Show depends on the support of our viewers and listeners, and one way to keep us going is through Patreon, where you can pledge as little as $1 per month or as much as you want at patreon.com/David Pakman Show. Great perks and benefits as well. Read about them. Today, I'm going to be speaking with Kyle Riismandel, who's a senior university lecturer in the Department of History at the New Jersey Institute of Technology, also author of the book Neighborhood of Fear, The Suburban Crisis in American Culture. 1975 to 2001. It's great to have you on today, Kyle.
Thanks so much for having me, David.
So the suburbs as a concept were maybe more relevant or discussed in the 2020 presidential election than for a long time. And we heard from Donald Trump, the suburban women should love me. And we heard all of these different proclamations about rules and regulations regarding the study of racial inequality in suburbs, rules and guidance that Donald Trump wanted canceled, but Joe Biden, I guess, wanted to keep, although I didn't hear Joe Biden speak too much about it one way or the other. Can you talk a little bit about the modern suburb, not from the architectural standpoint of the subdivision, but as the sort of cultural thing of people who sometimes make a higher salary in a city but live outside of it? How long has that dynamic existed in the United States?
So it's pretty familiar in some ways, I think, to a lot of people from, growing up with television, right? And this is exactly what my cat will be interested in this conversation.
We love cats.
It's the second I start talking. While I was sitting quietly, she was just enjoying the sun. So it's that sort of sitcom suburb kind of idea, the nuclear family, the sort of strict gender roles. Everyone's happy, everyone's safe. And so that cultural ideal emerges after World War II with this, the invention of the modern suburb. So suburbs had existed before that, but they were not sort of necessarily the same kind of formation. And this is sort of aberrant in American history, this idea of the single family house, the nuclear family, and this arrangement of gender roles and sort of culture around neighboring, upward mobility, home ownership. These are all new things after World War II.
Correct me if I'm wrong, but it seems as though the culture of sort of fear in the suburbs about burglars, kidnappers, home invasions, people coming from the city, targeting people in suburbs. Is there something around the 70s that made that start to grow as an idea that people talked about?
Yeah, so there's a few things that happen. So one is, to your previous question, is that the suburbs are kind of founded on this idea of safety and family. And so people who move there in this sort of later period by the 1970s, right, they're expecting that kind of culture, that kind of environment, that kind of safety. And what they find by the mid-70s is that it's actually more dangerous than they imagined. And so in the ways you were just pointing out, sort of criminally, morally, environmentally. And to some degree, the fear is not necessarily external, right? It's not that it is people from the city coming to your suburb to rob you, but it's that people are lurking in your own neighborhood who are almost invisible, right? They are not this kind of necessarily racialized other, right? But they're people who can move freely and break into your home in the middle of the day, steal your child from the mall, do these kinds of things. So it's actually a moment where they start to feel this fear or threat internally rather than externally, right? Because the earlier period, as you probably know, is defined by sort of racial exclusion, right? And fears of racial integration. And those fears don't go away in that, after sort of 1975, but it includes now these internal threats.
Within cities, the concept of redlining is maybe known to many in the audience as a way to sort of dictate racial lines between neighborhoods. Can you talk a little bit about from the origins of suburbs, how were they racialized? What were the ways in which they were made sort of race-based neighborhoods in a sense?
Yeah, so as you're probably aware, racial segregation through space is not invented in 1945, right? That this exists consistently throughout American history,
right?
Obviously during the period of slavery, but even after, and Jim Crow, et cetera. That separating people by race and space is not new,
right?
What I really love is that she manages to go under the camera so I look insane. So the policy of redlining comes out in the 1930s and the Federal Housing Authority during the Great Depression as a way to help homeowners, particularly farm owners, not just homeowners, because there weren't that many homeowners. But one of the key ways in which they evaluate investment, right? So the government's giving out billions of dollars basically to rescue people, is they say, we must consider the character of the neighborhood, including who lives there, by race. And so this bakes into the rules of housing considerations of race and space and value. So when we have the suburban boom of the 1940s and 50s, banks, real estate agents, homeowners are all seeing property through the lens of race, that if black people live in my neighborhood, it'll be worth less. I won't be able to sell my home, et cetera, et cetera. And of course, the inverse is true, that black people then have extreme difficulty buying homes because they can't get loans. They won't be allowed into these neighborhoods. So this is sort of the legacy of redlining. What,
it seems intuitively that if you have people earning city salaries and buying homes in the suburbs, that is quite literally a transfer of wealth from one sort of structure to another. But there's probably more to that transfer when it comes to maybe political power or sort of in other ways. Can you talk about some of those other things?
Yeah, so the outcomes of redlining and suburbanization, right? So they're happening at the same time for the same reason. So you end up with urban crisis, which is this moment of a profound disinvestment in cities in the 1960s. It leads to the urban rebellions you probably know about, Watts or Newark, et cetera. So by the 70s, the mass exodus of, generally speaking, white people, but upwardly mobile white people, means that political power is following them, right? Representation in Congress, particularly representation in state legislatures. And frankly, it's as we know now, right, it's a lot easier to vote as a suburban white person than an urban person of color. So they are overrepresented in some sense politically. So that movement of people really is dragging with them this kind of base of voting power at sort of every level of government.
When Ronald Reagan was president, it seems as though that was great for the suburbs, but I'd be interested in hearing a little bit about, was it ideological and some of the stories that Reagan told, or was there any actual policy shift?
So both. Again, the sort of backlash against the welfare state ultimately, right, hurts cities more than suburbs. So by the time he becomes president, his policy of sort of localism, privatization, less government, et cetera, really empowers people who are already powerful, right? Government already helps them. They don't need a lot more help versus, say, people who need expanded welfare benefits or SNAP or something else. So this retrenchment of government and spending money on social welfare, healthcare, et cetera, allows suburbanites to be empowered because they already have all the advantages in the system. They're already structured to benefit them. So they don't necessarily, and in fact, they vote against those kinds of things, right? The tax revolts of the 1970s are exactly about that we don't want our tax money going into these urban places. We want it to stay in our neighborhoods. We want our money back. Right.
I want to talk a little bit about the power differences between just like small towns versus suburbs, but maybe first it would be useful to talk a little bit about when we talk about a suburb. I mean, I think the idea is it's part of a metro area connected to a city. It may have a downtown, but oftentimes it's not. It's maybe more residential and maybe not at all industrial. Like, these are just kind of intuitions, but how are we really defining what a suburb is versus what might just be a small town?
I mean, you put your finger on what is a lot of the historical work, right? Is trying to figure out what are we actually talking about here when we say suburban culture, suburban life, suburban place. And so part of the argument I make in the book, and I think part of the way I teach this to my students, is it is a construction, right? It is an idea as much as anything else. So it changes over time. What it means in 1955 is not the same as 1975 or 1995. So to your point, people imagine themselves as suburban, right, and have sort of enacting certain values, conducting themselves in a certain way around law and order or politics, et cetera, really is what makes them suburban. So space matters, and maybe relationship to a city matters to some degree, but it doesn't essentially define a suburb in a way that I think is ultimately consistent or allows us to say, this is absolutely a suburb, this is absolutely not.
So you could have a small town and describe it as suburban without it necessarily being a suburb because of, is it a combination of ideology, economics?
Yeah, exactly. It's culture, it's values, and it is space, right? That, the suburban sprawl of the 1970s, the continuous sort of development of land means that the further and further you go out, the less relationship any place is really going to have to an urban center. So, the urban center is the center of economic life, the urban center as sort of commuting or shopping, right? All these things go away by the 1970s and 80s for most people. And especially as you move further and further out, places like California or Pennsylvania, places that have a lot of farmland that get developed.
So what can we say would be some of the things that distinguish a suburb from just like a relatively wealthy, small city or large town?
So I would argue that I would probably always ask the question of like, when and where are we talking about? But I think, the consistent things, particularly in post-war America, are, right, single family housing, focus on the nuclear family or this idea of the nuclear family around these particular gender roles. And I think a culture of privatization and local control, that the idea that I live here for these reasons. I control the space, the school board, the mayor. And this is in some way an economic investment in my future by owning a home. That those things are pretty consistent as what I would consider suburban values. But how they play out is really, again, kind of depends on when we're talking about. And this is part of the argument of the book is by the late 70s, people are starting to define themselves in relationship to their fears. That instead of saying this is what I own and what I have and I feel safe, I am now afraid of these number of things, and I'm going to react to them in certain ways.
That's interesting. So to put some examples to it, a kind of wealthier college town in North Carolina or Western Massachusetts, those might be suburban, at least in their sort of feel and idea, but maybe like a poor Midwestern small city or large town with tons of public housing would not be suburban under this general idea.
Yeah, and I mean, again, intentionally so, and this sort of gets back to redlining and then ultimately urban renewal policies after World War II, which is suburbs, many places outside of cities passed laws forbidding public housing itself, right? Saying we will not even allow it to be built here. So, and public housing really stops being built by the 1970s. We moved to this sort of voucher system and other things. But we're even having this conversation today, and back to your sort of original point about Donald Trump, part of what he was saying about fair housing, open housing, equal housing, right, is that he was trying to scare suburbanites that they will build apartment buildings, right, to facilitate, more dense housing, right?
Yeah.
Which he's sort of saying undermines the idea of your neighborhood, the culture of the place.
Yeah, so let's talk. I mean, when Trump was talking about the suburbs will be over under Joe Biden and all this, it seemed to me that there was a racialized aspect of the idea of dangerous brown people coming into a place that's currently mostly white. Is that a crazy way to interpret what he was getting at?
No, and I think the thing about Trump is that he's stuck in a particular vision of America already, right? That of the 50s, 60s, maybe even the 1970s, that was that moment, right? That was very truly, the suburbs were truly defined by these very strict boundaries around race and class, to the point where you have white citizens councils, policing streets to keep out black people from moving through, not just moving in. But his vision is old politically and sort of, I think, just in any material sense. The suburb he's trying to defend is already gone. That suburban residents and voters largely hold these progressive values, even if they don't enact them. So they're never going to come out and say, we don't want blank, right? They're going to say, we want to protect this neighborhood, the culture of this place, right? The character of the neighborhood. And that allows them to do all sorts of things, right? Not just keep out perhaps people they see as lower class or racialized to others, but also environmental things they see as dangerous, et cetera. So it gives them a lot of power to not play the race card, to think about it in racial terms. And in fact, I think they endorse in many ways sort of progressive or values around diversity. So
I guess the question would be, are suburbs actually progressive, or do they endorse a language of progressivism and they could really range politically?
Yeah, this is the lesson of the 1980s, is that, and to some degree the reaction to civil rights, is that white people learn to use the language of civil rights to make claims. And this includes suburbanites. And they learn how to talk about race and class without talking about race and class. The euphemisms of all these things. The famous Lee Atwater quote, the strategist for Ronald Reagan, and George H.W. Bush, that, you can't go around screaming the N-word anymore. You have to say, it's about school integration or whatever it might be. So to some degree, I would say, yes, you're right, that what suburbanites care about is an ideology of local power, that what serves that interest, they will embrace. So they might vote for Joe Biden or Barack Obama or even Bill Clinton, right? But they don't necessarily want them to enact those changes in their neighborhood.
Yeah.
Even though they still embrace that idea of sort of what I think we'd consider progressive values.
One of the phrases or claims that's been thrown around a lot recently is that more and more people are going back to living in cities and in urban environments. It seems that there would be some kind of seesaw effect, suburb, rural, and city. And if more people are heading to cities, that would cause a change not only in the cities, but also in the suburbs. But is that the case? What are the changes we're seeing as a result of that?
Yeah, I think the second or third generation of people raised in suburbs return to the city as quote unquote fun city, the place to go that is gentrified, that is safe. Some scholars make the argument that this is the suburbanization of the city itself, right? We sort of erase or marginalize the people who've been in these neighborhoods for many years, mostly Latinx or Black. We make it safe. We bring these amenities, these restaurants, these bars. We sort of idealize this past, this sort of industrial past in our culture. But really, it's about bringing in this kind of investment, right? The kind of tourism dollars, consumer dollars, rental dollars that didn't exist there before, as a reaction to the bland staleness of the suburbs, right? Like, all the things that people are saying in the 1980s, particularly in hardcore punk of, this is just boring and horrible and terrible. And it's about TV and fast food, whereas this authentic urban experience exists that I can access.
Big picture, just to kind of wrap the conversation, in thinking about the next, 10, 20 years, What do you see as sort of the shifts in terms of rural, suburban, and urban that seem to be guided by the interests of the people that are now becoming homeowners? Will the shift to urbanization continue, or do you expect it to change or reverse?
Well, one is there are fewer homeowners, right? So probably, I suspect you're around my age or younger. Our generation are not going to be the generation of homeowners in the same way because we're not being facilitated by the market or the government to own homes. So we may inherit homes, many of us, right? Because we're, largely white people will get our parents or grandparents' homes. But home ownership, I think, as an idea, might have to be really reconfigured because people are desiring some intermediary between urban and suburban experiences, convenience, locality, but also some sort of idea of authenticity. But the pandemic also really throws us into high relief, right? We've seen, I think the exodus is maybe overemphasized, but people have moved out of the city, seeing it as sort of the home of pestilence, right? This kind of almost 19th century idea of the city. So it's hard to say, and thinking about public health or other things, what that might really mean. We may really see people kind of move far out and go, quote unquote, back to the land, like a lot of people did in the 1970s.
Yeah, that's a question which I think, as you point out, we just don't really know yet. It's a new question. We've been speaking with Kyle Riismandel, who's a senior university lecturer in history at the New Jersey Institute of Technology. The book is Neighborhood of Fear: The Suburban Crisis in American Culture, 1975 to 2001. Kyle, so great having you on. I really appreciate it.
Thanks for having me. I really enjoyed it.
The David Pakman Show is now on Instagram at David Pakman Show. You can check out behind the scenes pictures, memes, shots of the studio, shots of what Pat does all day. Very, very concerning to a lot of people. All of that and more on the David Pakman Show Instagram account at David Pakman Show. So in all likelihood, Donald Trump is not nearly as rich as he claims to be. We know that Donald Trump inflates the value of his real estate when it's for the purposes of claiming a higher net worth or when it's for the purposes of securing a loan, but minimizes the value of his real estate when it's an effort to avoid taxation. But this story is just kind of weird because presumably Donald Trump is a billionaire. The question is, to what degree is he a billionaire? And yet in the last few months, Donald Trump has taken $65,000 in optional federal pension payments for former presidents since he left office in January. And you might recall that during his presidency, Trump made a very big deal out of donating his presidential salary back to different federal agencies, maybe some charities, maybe it was just agencies, and he doesn't need the money and all of that different stuff. And yet, billionaire Donald Trump is now taking $65,000 from the presidential pension fund. Now, you might remember the Constitution requires that presidents take a salary while in office. They can donate it back. Fine. But there's nothing constitutionally that says an ex-president must take their pension. Now, this is, of course, completely within Trump's rights to do, but I find it strange to some degree because if you look at a more realistic estimate of Donald Trump's net worth, it's $2.3 billion. Relative to $2.3 billion, $65,000 is 0.0028% of his net worth. So to think about it in terms that might be more applicable to the average person, this is equivalent to someone with the median American net worth, which is $121,000, going through a process to request $3.40. Think about that for a second. If you retire from a job or you get laid off or whatever, and someone comes to you and they say, sir, if you want, you can request a pension. You go through this process and we'll give you $3.40. Would most people go through that trouble if their net worth is $121,000? That's what Donald Trump is doing here. So what's going on? I mean, it reminds me of, people who go to the bank to cash a check for 12 cents. The upside is by taking this, he seems to recognize he's no longer the president because this is a federal pension for ex-presidents. So maybe that's sort of like an upside here. And being a former president comes with many perks. There's lifetime Secret Service protection. There's travel reimbursements. There's medical insurance. There's a budget for an office and staff. And the presidential library, maybe they have to fundraise for the presidential library. Now I don't remember. But the point is, in terms of the pension, it's not mandatory. So is Trump just so greedy and so cheap that he won't turn anything down, and he'll go through the process of getting something that is the equivalent at his net worth of $3.40 for a person of average or median net worth? Maybe he needs the money because a lot of that net worth is completely illiquid. Is he desperate? I don't know. We've talked about those controversial loans that we knew would start to come due during what would have been his second term, and thankfully is not because he lost. Maybe that's related, but I find that there's something sort of strange about it. And maybe it's as simple. I mean, let me know what you think. Maybe it really is as simple as Donald Trump just can't turn any money down because of his personality and because of who he is. Maybe there's some other explanation. I don't know. But billionaire, multi-billionaire Donald Trump going through the process of requesting, filing for, and obtaining what is, for his level of net worth, equivalent to $3 worth of a federal presidential pension for ex-presidents. Am I the only one finding something weird about that? Let me know. This is really funny. As many of you know, or maybe you don't, and I'll tell you, Joe Biden is sort of doing pretty okay as president. There's no perfect president. Every president does lots of things that people don't agree with, that I don't agree with. Okay. But in this hyper-polarized environment that we have in the United States, Joe Biden's approval is quite healthy. It's much higher than Donald Trump's ever was. And Joe Biden already in these first few months of his presidency has some important major achievements, including the COVID relief bill, including an incredibly successful vaccine rollout, and some other things with much more planned. Fox News and other right-wing media are completely out of ideas about what to cover. They tried fake scandals. They tried ginning up a crisis at the border, which sort of worked, actually. They tried attacking the relationship between Joe and Jill Biden as fake and stage managed for public perception. And none of it is really sticking. I mean, the border thing is sticking a little bit, but a lot of this stuff is just not sticking. And look at the pathetic things that they tried last night alone. Here is Tucker Carlson claiming that Joe Biden's Secretary of Defense, Lloyd Austin, said that the single greatest risk our soldiers face is having to serve alongside Trump supporters. But when you watch the clip of Lloyd Austin that he plays, Lloyd Austin doesn't actually say that. It is a fake scandal. Take a look.
Existential. If you've got a cliche, he will read it on television. That was Lloyd Austin, of course. Lloyd Austin is a former defense contractor, not surprisingly. He's a full-time ideologue as well. Having Lloyd Austin at the Pentagon is like handing control of the entire U.S. military to the editorial page of the New York Times. Here is Lloyd Austin explaining that the single scariest risk our soldiers face is the possibility they might have to serve alongside Americans who didn't vote for Joe Biden.
And if confirmed, I will fight hard to stamp out sexual assault and to rid our ranks of racist and extremists. The job of the Department of Defense is to keep America safe from our enemies. But we can't do that if some of those enemies lie within our own ranks.
He's a joke and a mediocrity. And of course, he was confirmed by the Senate as if he was impressive, but he's not.
So understand that. Tucker says Lloyd Austin claimed the biggest risk to our troops is serving alongside people who didn't vote for Joe Biden. He plays a clip, and in the clip, Lloyd Austin says, we've got to get sexual assault out of the military, we've got to get racists out of the military, and we've got to get extremists out of the military. Now, maybe Tucker Carlson knows that the racists and the extremists and the sexual assaulters are Trump supporters. I don't know. I'm not saying that. But linguistically, I can't see any other connection between what Tucker Carlson said is in that clip and what Lloyd Austin actually says. Then Tucker Carlson uses the latest Bill Gaetz, Jeffrey Epstein revelations to just wide openly pander to the QAnon people. Take a look at this.
So it is days after Bill Gaetz told us on Twitter that he was getting a divorce, there is new information about his relationship with Jeffrey Epstein. You know, those conspiracy theorists say a small group of really powerful people control the world and have an interest in little kids. Just a conspiracy theory. But we will tell you what we do know. That's just ahead.
Edgy stuff, right? So just straight up pandering to QAnon there. Maybe this helps his ratings. Maybe he has a big QAnon contingent in his audience. I don't really know. Then Sean Hannity brings in Donald Trump Jr. for a segment on the Steele dossier from, was it 2016, 2017? We're almost halfway through 2021. And Hannity brings on the son of a former president to talk about a 5-year-old document. Fox host Laura Ingraham going with a narrative about the Democratic Party being in chaos and falling apart and being in disarray. She had one headline called "Things Are Clearly Falling Apart for Democrats," and then another which included right-wing bomb thrower Dinesh D'Souza as a guest, which was called, quote, "GOP Views Gain Traction as Dems in Disarray." And of course, this is all completely fake. It's all completely made up. If the current administration is notable for anything, it's that we are 4 months in and there are just no scandals and things are calm and uncontroversial. Now, we can all say, well, Joe Biden didn't handle stopping the deportations the way that he promised, and I would be right there with you. And Joe Biden hasn't done enough here, or he hasn't done enough there, or I don't like the deadline he set for when to get troops out of Afghanistan. He set it at September 11th. He should have done it by May 1st, like Donald Trump. These are all fair criticisms and things that we can all talk about. But there's really no disarray. There's really no scandal. There's really no chaos. We're 4 months in. Joe Biden has gotten some major things done. Most Americans are more or less happy with it. And Americans are very happy with the COVID stimulus bill that was done. Americans are very happy with Joe Biden's handling of the pandemic. And Americans are very happy with Joe Biden's handling of the vaccine rollout. Lastly, from Laura Ingraham, another blockbuster, powerful story called, quote, "The left doesn't actually have an agenda." And this one is particularly funny because Joe Biden passed COVID stimulus, rolled out vaccines, has a jobs bill proposal, has an infrastructure bill proposal, has made some tweaks to gun safety. Doesn't mean you have to like them or think they're enough, but he made some tweaks to gun safety. And yet it is Republicans who for 4 years, and especially now, openly so, Mitch McConnell said it, they are not about anything other than stop Democrats from doing anything. Under Barack Obama, the Republican agenda was stop Obama from doing anything. Under Trump, the agenda was undo anything we can that Barack Obama did. And under Joe Biden, the agenda is not really an agenda. It's prevent Joe Biden from doing anything. It's a good critique not having an agenda, not being for anything. If it were true, it happens to be true of the Republican Party. And I don't know if they can do this for the next 4 years. Like at some point, will they have to come up with something more substantive to slam Joe Biden about? At some point, I mean, most presidents have some scandals. Obama was sort of out of the ordinary in the sense that he didn't have any major scandal. Will they come up with something substantive, or will something happen that is actually a fair critique of Joe Biden that would fall under the umbrella of scandal or disarray? Let me know what you think, but they seem committed to trying to stop Joe Biden from doing anything and from claiming that Joe Biden is getting nothing done and is embroiled in scandal when that's actually not the case that's going on. Let me know what you think. Can they do this for 4 years without anything substantive? We have a voicemail number, and that number is 219-2-DAVID-P. In the wake of the Matt Gaetz allegations of possible statutory rape and child sex trafficking and so on and so forth, we had a great caller with advice. This is important advice. This is important advice for anybody in the audience. If you want to avoid being charged with statutory rape, okay, and I think most people would want to avoid being charged with that. Here is a caller explaining to you how to do it. Take a listen.
Hi, this is Jane from Pennsylvania.
Right.
There is one sure way for a man to avoid being charged with statutory rape. Mm-hmm. If you don't know her well enough to know her correct age, don't have sex with her.
Wow.
Bye.
What a vote. I don't know why I love that caller. I think it's the delivery and the accent, and it's just absolutely perfect. Yeah, that's good advice. And now, you know, there will be, you hear about these stories where the accused will say, they lied about their age. They just lied. And, you know, the difference, if I'm 30, the difference between a 17 and an 18-year-old is not obvious. And what am I going to do? Check for ID or something like that. So you'll hear those stories. But generally speaking, this is good advice. And I mean, in most cases, wouldn't you be able to, you know, if you're, I don't even want to speculate, but the point is, you would learn the truth of someone's life. And like, if they're going to high school rather than college or whatever, you would think that these cases of I was really tricked by someone claiming to be of a certain age, those seem like they would be relatively rare. And I think that the advice there from Jane is quite good. We've got a great bonus show coming up for you today. We will talk about pro-tax billionaires who are protesting not in front of Jeff Bezos' house, but in front of Jeff Bezos' many homes. Okay, that's a protest that pro-tax millionaires are undertaking. Number 2, the Supreme Court is restricting police authority to enter homes without a warrant. And we will talk about the circumstances. And number 3, a new study from the World Health Organization finds that overwork has killed more than 745,000 people in a year. This is why we do our 6-month vacations that we are so well known for. This is a real issue, and it's more an issue in some countries than in others. And we're going to talk about the cultural aspect of it. We're going to talk about the physiological aspect of it. But 750,000 people in a year believed to have died from what is being described as overwork. And we will talk about all of those stories and much more when I am joined by producer Pat on today's bonus show. We may even give some awards out to the bonus show today. Get instant access by becoming a member at joinpakman.com or becoming a patron at patreon.com/David Pakman Show. Patreon.com/David Pakman Show. I'll see you on the bonus show.